Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Roger Noriega, visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. You're very welcome. I told the ambassador, estás en su casa, and it's the truth, really. They're neighbors. The Colombian embassy just being across the street. We welcome you all. Let me just say at the outset, if you will silence your cell phones, that'll make it agreeable for all of us and less embarrassing for you in case a babysitter calls or something. I'm going to ask our distinguished guest to make some initial comments after I introduce him, and then we'll throw it open to questions for the balance of our hour together. Ambassador Juan Carlos Pinzón has been Colombia's ambassador to the United States for 14 months. Previously, he served for nearly 4 years as Colombia's Minister of Defense, where he led that nation's armed forces in dealing severe blows to the operations and infrastructure of the FARC, the ELN, and the BACRIM, the criminal bands operating in that country. This resulted in improved security conditions throughout the country and the lowest homicide rate in 35 years. During his tenure, the armed forces' equipment and training were modernized. No less important, the welfare of the men and women in uniform and of their families has improved, and he put in place a transformation plan that will lead the armed forces forward for the next 2 decades. What most people do not know is that Colombia is an exporter of expertise in the security area, having lent its expertise to 60 different countries in how to deal with criminal organizations and drug trafficking. Before serving as a defense minister, Ambassador Pinzón was the chief of staff to President Juan Manuel Santos and vice minister of defense. He's a native of Bogota, Colombia. He holds an MS degree in economics from Javeriana in Bogota. He received a master's in public policy from Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School. He has also completed advanced studies in international relations at Johns Hopkins and in science and technology at Harvard. So clearly you're well prepared for many, many tasks, and we welcome you here today. Ambassador, as I've said to you in the past, some of my most skeptical Colombian friends were rejoicing on the night of the plebiscite. Others, quite frankly, were devastated by the results, harshly criticizing the no campaign and the popular vote. I fell somewhere in the middle because I had reconciled myself to the fact that the plebiscite would probably approve the accords. And although I'm deeply skeptical about the FARC's intentions, I saw the accords as an opportunity, with strong support from the United States, to hold the FARC to some concrete commitments and to demobilize thousands of guerrillas in that framework, many thousands of whom were really kidnapped into the guerrilla movement. In the weeks since the plebiscite, you've seen President Santos meet with his predecessor, President Álvaro Uribe. I've heard that was for the first time in 6 years that they'd met. Perhaps that's true, maybe not. He's also met with President Andrés Pastrana, one of his other predecessors, both of whom were part of the no campaign. Last Thursday, President Uribe, on behalf of that camp, offered a 26-page critique that raised many concerns, that also presented some sort of red lines that have been regarded as rather reasonable and practical. Indeed, he adopted more practical positions on a number of critical issues. I think this may be a function of the fact that regardless of the results of the plebiscite, student marches and other mobilizations, a letter from business leaders have made it very clear that the Colombian people are essentially committed to some sort of negotiated permanent end to the hostilities. But as a result of the voting, President Santos has had to sit down with these skeptics, to hear them out, to take their concerns back to the negotiating table with the objective of improving that accord in a way that would broaden its support among the Colombian people. So maybe that narrow victory on the behalf of the no in the end will actually improve the process for a durable peace reflecting a national consensus. In other words, in the words of the legendary political theorists Keith Richards and Mick Jagger, you can't always get what you want, but if you try sometime, you just might find that you get what you need. So, Ambassador, where is Colombia's peace process today? What condition is it in? Do you feel more or less optimistic today than the night of the plebiscite, and why?
Well, first of all, Roger, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here at the Enterprise Institute, especially having this beautiful new venue that you have here. I'm very impressed. I'm very happy to be, I'm sure I'm not the first, but one of the first commentators in this new venue. Second, you have been inviting me to enterprise discussions for a year already, since I arrived. And I say yes, and suddenly there was a big coincidence between my yes and the current juncture. So I'm happy to be here, and it's good to have this opportunity to discuss. You always have been interested about Colombia, and one of the things I learned to appreciate the most about Washington is that we have even more friends than I knew. Washington is full of friends of Colombia, and there are many reasons for that. The success from U.S. policy perspective that has happened in Colombia is quite interesting. Has been bipartisan, has been a long-term sustained effort, and has resulted in the most violent country in the hemisphere, not to tell that we had at a point the two most violent cities in the world, to become now explorer of security, a country that somehow is finding a final way to peace, is in transition to peace, if I can call it, and all that, no doubt, with the determination and commitment of Colombian people, of our leaders, but at the same time, with very important U.S. support. U.S. support came to Colombia to enable Colombia, to allow Colombia to be effective in its institutions, from security, that part I knew and I saw with a lot of interest, with justice, and with development. And that package is what we know as Plan Colombia. So I know here in Washington there's a lot of people that feel that in one way or another, as it happened in Colombia, there's a lot of contributors to this effort. And I see it as a positive element. To your comments and to your question, I think we are in the middle of a very interesting time in Colombia. First thing I would say and underline is it's interesting to see the strength of Colombian democracy. There are very few democracies in this part of the world itself, that can handle such an event, such a political debate with the intensity and the commitment from all the sides, and somehow be able to have that as a result. Second, I believe it's important to see the strength of Colombian institutions. Every process that we have lived in the past years in Colombia is absolutely related to our constitutional framework, to the separation of powers. The president has expressed and proposed ideas, but those have been discussed in Congress and later on judged by our judiciary system. So I think that's another important event. And when you think about the results, the first word President Santos used was not only he's the president of every Colombian, but that his main objective was to keep precisely the institutional stability of the country. And immediately, he opened the room for a political dialogue and a political discussion with every sector opposing to the government proposal in the plebiscite. So I think that's another interesting feature. And the third element that I believe is now part of our political discussion is somehow opportunity. And this word has been expressed by President Santos, but by several bright experts from different sides. Right, left, center, international leaders, Colombian leaders, everybody has come to that word. Colombia is in front of an opportunity. And this is why, because we have been moving from, let's say, peacemaking with the use of legitimate force. That's what we did for a while. You know, people can talk about long or several decades of war, but what I can tell you is that when Colombian state and Colombian people decide that we were going to confront the threats of crime, violence, and violation of human rights, started really 15, 16 years ago. And since then, we became very effective. We degrade, to mention the FARC, probably to 30 to 35% of what they were in manpower, resources, or financial capabilities. But the same happened to the ELN. But the same happened to the criminal bands that inherited somehow the existence after the AUC, the so-called paramilitary. So I think that effort to degrade them put Colombia in a position of precisely moving towards an effort for peace from strength. And I think that's another important argument. The country has been building its discussions and its political process from the strength. And that is why, as of today, this has been the only time in which FARC has agreed with Colombian state. Colombian state was able to sign an agreement, political agreement, a very complex discussion. I think nobody can hesitate to call it in a different way. This is a very complex political discussion. But at the end, for the first time ever, there was an agreement signed about this. I think on the other side, it's important to see that that opportunity, as described, is seen from the perspective that if we were doing peacemaking by the use of force, and starting 4 or 5 years ago, we start the transition to peace through a political process, to a peace dialogue. What happened, probably as consequence of the plebiscite, was that that transition to peace is going to take some more time. And what I can tell is nobody knows what that time is, but it's part of the process. And that's the way I would see it. And of course, next phase will be peace in Colombia and the execution of the implementation of the consequence of the agreement. So with those 3 words, I will describe where are we today. We have strong institutions, we proved that. We have a strong democracy, we proved that. And now we are in the middle of a political process towards an opportunity, and to see how that translates and how the Colombian people will result into something specific. The importance about democracy here in America or in Colombia or in places where democracy is mature and strong is that things are not solved by one single will or by the desire. They are discussed. They are part of a process. They are a debate, and then they result into something specific. I also believe that there are other features that happen after the plebiscite. The fact that President Santos was recognized as a Nobel Prize winner for peace, I think is an important issue, an important international signal to Colombian efforts to peace. Of course, a recognition to the president. I keep saying that any Colombian should feel proud about this just because it was the Colombian, but in this case, the president of Colombians who granted that recognition. And that has been the consequence, as I insist, of being effective with the use of force, with legitimate use of force, defeating threats, but in consequence, moving to political tools, moving to diplomacy, and making use of those tools to produce a result, an agreement. That's what I think has been recognized. Of course, we gotta let the experts from Oslo to describe how they got to that conclusion, but somehow that's what you can summarize. I think that's an important element in the current discussion. The other element that has been interesting is the public political activity from different points of view and different perspectives is not only granted to the natural leaders and the leadership of Colombia and different political views, but it's almost any Colombian these days, giving a point of view, giving an opinion. Another interesting element that came out in these weeks has been the clear conclusion, if anyone had doubt, I never doubted, but if anyone doubted, that Colombians were hoping and are willing for peace. But of course, what is in discussion is different approaches to that result. But I think that's another interesting element. And finally, I think that the fact that the government was able to announce very recently, and as a conclusion to the recent events, that the ELN, the other guerrilla, is starting a formal public peace negotiation with the Colombian government. So it proves somehow that all the elements that are required for a peace long-term in Colombia are now on the table. Not to forget that ceasefire was immediately requested and recommended not only by President Santos with his authority as Commander-in-Chief of Colombian Armed Forces, but immediately it was suggested and requested by different opposition leaders, and immediately was somehow accepted and discussed even by the FARC. So for those who were expecting some kind of turbulence beyond the political debate, nothing as such has happened in the country. And what we have right now is a ceasefire that actually has formal elements coming out not only from a government to FARC and FARC agreement, but also by UN presence and UN mandate to contribute to maintain that stability in the country. So I believe, sure, we are at an interesting time. No doubt we are extending our transition to peace. No doubt there is an interesting, challenging political process as part of all this, through democracy, with strong institutions. But in addition to that, the country continues to move forward. You know, when you see what happened to the markets, to the US dollar, what happened? Didn't climb up. It went up 15 pesos, moved down 15, 20 pesos, and frankly speaking, nothing substantial has been altered in the Colombian economy and markets. And by the way, we're in the middle of an interesting discussion on how to strengthen our competitiveness in our economy through a tax reform that is now under discussion. And we're in a process of finding how to keep moving forward, to attract investors, to attract jobs, to keep moving to the future. That's the way I would describe it, not to underestimate the challenges, not to underestimate the debate, but to value somehow the importance of what we have right now and the political realities that are at hand right now in Colombia.
Thank you very much for that initial scene setter. By the way,
so can I leave now?
Did somebody get some water? I don't think do you have water there?
Oh yeah, I have.
Okay, good. Right.
I have.
I couldn't see whether you had. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Let's talk a little bit about what's transpired recently. Last Thursday, President Uribe put together this plan, this vision for a national peace accord. And what's been remarked upon is that he sort of pulled back on a couple of essential issues. And I know there's a limit to how you want to characterize things, particularly from your diplomatic post. But there, for example, he had insisted during the campaign, and many others in the No campaign had made it an important part of their opposition that there would be potentially some of these FARC commanders literally getting away with murder, no incarceration, and that this was something that needed to be addressed. He's introduced or adopted a concept of reclusion that Marta Lucia Ramirez had put forward that could mean some sort of confinement in general spaces. And some have commented, well, the accords sort of accommodate that. The other issue that he's talked about is transitional justice. In that case, he's said, you know, I think this commenting that we've demobilized tens of thousands of people. We've even held people accountable in the past decade within the context of our judicial system. And we don't need to have this transitional ad hoc commission created with participation of foreigners. And Andres Pastrana, the former president, has also commented, and he went on at length with me about this a number of months ago, that we should be doing this in the context of our judicial system and not create this other entity. Those are a couple of things that he's brought up. And then on political participation, can the commanders of the FARC who were guilty of, or found guilty, responsible for serious human rights abuses, enter the political realm? Pulled back from opposition to having representation in the Congress, but setting some limits about who among the FARC might be able to participate. How do you see this conversation shaping up between the Santos government and the negotiators and these opponents of the process who are reflecting the will of the majority of the people that voted on it?
Well, first, the issues that are under discussion are very delicate, very complex, and very relevant. Any opinion onto those these days does not contribute on any way. I can tell you that I can assure you that here I see a lot of Colombian faces, and I can promise every Colombian today has a personal opinion or a group opinion or an institutional opinion or government opinion onto each of these elements. But the truth is that President Santos, once the plebiscite happened, opened a round of discussions. You described those very well, set of meetings with different leaders. And by the way, somehow a negotiating table looking for an agreement. Under that framework, government has been taking every proposal, every idea, every recommendation, and is now up to this process to bring some kind of conclusions on what is most convenient and what is more feasible. And I think those are, the ways things are being discussed right now. In that regard, I think President Santos has expressed both on his will, on the opportunity, and at the same time mentioned several times the word realistic and as fast as possible. Those are a little bit of the messaging that has been coming out. From the opposition side, I would recognize, in general terms, everybody's will to contribute and to move into some kind of agreement. Being very honest and very transparent, I believe that we are in a time in Colombia in which the best contribution someone can do, and especially here from Washington, is allow that discussion to move on, is allow that discussion to produce a result, rather than putting more personal opinions onto such a delicate set of issues. And that will be my preference in current times. That will be the best possible contribution from any Colombian. Allow this to be discussed in a way that there's some kind of compromise and agreement, so that can be later on discussed with the FARC and other groups, and then move on to the next phase.
Well, if you're asking people to withhold their opinions, you're going to put a lot of people out of work here in Washington. but at least because they're here and because they'll be hearing you in a couple of other places this week, there'll be better informed decisions and opinions. What's the FARC's attitude about this opportunity? President Santos spent a good deal of time saying that the guerrillas aren't going to negotiate their way into prison. That's just one issue. Do you think they will be back at the table? I mean, what's your sense of what they're saying, and what if President Santos is aggregating some of these comments and ideas about how to move forward? It seems to suggest that he'll ask the FARC to join them again at the negotiating table to open some of these issues up.
Well, the only thing we can judge right now is what has been said publicly. And what has been said publicly is, from their perspective, that they are willing to keep the ceasefire. That's one point. And second, that they are willing to open discussions, for a new round and to find, additional steps. Of course, there are some words a little bit out of tone that, I would insist we should not even hear at this time and focus very much on, how to keep moving on the current opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to ask one more question and then I'm going to throw it open. And this is on the question of Plan Colombia and where we go from here with Paz Colombia. You know that I was one of the architects from the staff level of Plan Colombia, and it was very fortuitous because I moved from the House to the Senate in the middle of that process. So I was one of the few people that a lot of people trusted because, as people don't necessarily understand, in the House, the enemy is not the Republicans or the Democrats, it's the Senate is the enemy. And so I got to see that come together in this bipartisan coalition and commitment. But it was a commitment to help an ally, the South America's oldest democracy, defend its institutions and impose the rule of law. But in large measure because of the drug phenomenon and the fact that the FARC, which has now been identified as the biggest cocaine trafficking organization in the world, was shoveling cocaine into the United States and affecting the health, well-being of the American people. So we made that commitment. $10 billion later, in the last several years, we've seen coca cultivation increasing by at least 50%, and some pulling back in the context of these negotiations from the offensives against the FARC, pulling back on extradition, where for the first time in a decade or so, Colombia has refused to extradite someone to the United States because he also happens to be a FARC commander. And you've reversed yourselves on aerial fumigation, which I guess is one of the reasons that the coca cultivation has increased. If you're sitting in Congress representing the American taxpayer, what case do you make for an additional $500 million in assistance and even longer-term commitment to Colombia going forward?
Oh, thank you for that question. I believe that's a very important and very relevant for the time. First, I think what we have done with Plan Colombia that worked effectively for several years, I insist, was doing peace building, and that's what we did for a lot of time. You can criticize some elements, you can have different opinions on parts of the agenda and the strategy, but as you said, those who crafted and those of us who have been working on this for a long time, we have found this as a tool to produce a concrete result. And the result was the complete turnaround of Colombia, from a failing nation to a vibrant democracy, active economy, and a country that is setting a democratic agenda to the future. That's a little bit of what happened to Colombia. And you, but many others here in Washington, need to feel proud of it. From US policy perspective, but somehow from Colombian perspective, the reality is that we have cut poverty by half, we have reduced unemployment, we have increased investment, the economy has grown, and all this, with a strong base of strengthening insecurity indicators. We discussed from the end of last year, around this time when we arrived, the importance of understanding that we were going to enter into a new phase, that peace building with the use of legitimate force was not now the only thing that we were going to do, but on the contrary, that we were going to focus on a transition to peace, on a real, effective, active peace building effort. And that's how the agenda of Peace Colombia came in. The State Department, the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, President Obama himself, in presence of President Santos, and now Congress, have concluded that Colombia needed a new package to make peace sustainable in the long term and to guarantee that these gains of transformation of Colombia become permanent. Those are important for Colombia, but those are important for the United States. The fact that Colombia can be a country that can promote democracy, freedom, markets in the Western Hemisphere is not only important for Colombia, but somehow is important for our set of values. The possibility of Colombia continuing to export training, security, standards to other countries in Latin America is not only important for Colombia, it's strategically important for the United States as a whole. And I think that is what explains why actually in the House we have an approval of $550 million and in the Senate $450 million. I wish we get the House, you know, now you mentioned those words, but well, it's up to the US Congress, it's up to the political process and budget, and we have to understand even that this is an election year that has implications that I'm not the one to discuss. So in that perspective, I believe it's very important in the months and the year to come to get those resources, precisely to make this peace sustainable on issues like taking development to the marginal areas of the country, on issues like offering programs related to the humanitarian efforts, on the mining, on taking care of victims, on moving on to all these processes that are related to an stabilization and a transition to peace. And of course, there are other elements that are important, like strengthening the justice system. Justice is going to be extremely important in the years to come to precisely make that peace sustainable and credible, and keeping the capabilities to confront organized crime, drug trafficking, illegal mining, human trafficking, or other sources of crime and violence that are not going to disappear, are going to be there and are things that we will need to confront. This, as I said before, is not only important for Colombia. As much as we contain crime in Colombia, it's not only good for Colombia, but it's good for Central America, it's good for the Caribbean, it's good for Mexico, it's good for the United States. You know, it's a whole set of nations that benefit out of this. Moving to drug trafficking and your question and concern. During my tenure as Minister of Defense, I had the fortune to see and to testify the wonderful successes of our armed forces. And by the year 2012 and 2013, we got the lowest number of hectares of coca in the history of Colombia, and in the history of this relationship and efforts. So that was great, you know, and very good news. Starting then, we have seen an increase by different reasons. What we have learned on this process is that the threats are not static, they're dynamic. And they learn out of your tools. So they learn how to somehow take advantage or deny part of our capabilities and our efforts, and suddenly they start to use communities and present them in front of some of the coca eradication. They start to create different pressures to limit that success. The truth is that, as you described, last year, numbers are there, are public, those coca crops went up. What has been Colombian reaction? First, we're not happy with it. We want to confront that. President Santos himself has said, I want to produce results onto this. I am committed to it. Of course, he's trying to find new tools. Out of the peace agreement, he thought, and his vision is that having FARC out of drug dealing and with the commitment, expecting the owner, but with the commitment of not being part of that business, that will have long-term consequences to reduce that effect. Second, and more aggressive effort on alternative development, because we know it works. There are regions in Colombia in which alternative development has worked very well. In the central part of the country where you have roads, where you have technical assistance, we have been able to reduce coca even to zero. In the areas that are marginal, that are distant, in which state presence is not very effective or very stable, The truth is that their, drug comes back and you reduce it and suddenly it can grow again. It has the potential. So that's what we learn, and this is why under the Ministry of Post-Conflict there has been, we're in a process of developing and executing a integrated strategy towards that end. And on the hard side, there are very important efforts to do two things. One, for instance, there are new strategies that are, I would say, under trial, like manual fumigation or spraying. We don't know if that's going to work effectively or not, but we are always evolving, looking for new tools or new challenges or new ways to confront this. And finally, interdiction. Colombia in the past 2 years, year 15 and actually year 16, is seizing more cocaine than ever. Now, anyone can say, well, it's because there's more production, no doubt. But at the same time, a lot of that cocaine that is being produced additionally is not getting into the markets. And that's a way precisely to contain these efforts. Under my watch, probably last major operation we launched was an active action against the criminal bands, especially the so-called Urabeños, and they have like 3 or 4 names. These are a very large cartel, and they have been very heavily hit the past year and a half, 2 years. So the consequence of that is that also that is limiting the potential or constraining the potential of that additional drug to really have a major impact into the market, which again does not satisfy anyone. In a sense that we need to see how we can produce more results and keep moving forward to this. But I will underline the will of Colombian government to continue to confront this challenge. It's us and probably no more than us that know the consequences of not moving onto this and not continue to be dynamic onto these efforts. And finally, I would say that the worst mistake any can take after the experience we have had in Colombia is not to support the efforts to confront the challenges. Of course, I think we're open to the dialogue of how to do it better, how to improve one technique or to have a new one. I think that's part of all discussion. But this is why you told me, make a case to Congress. Keep pushing for this, because we need to make peace sustainable as the most important objective. Even if the transition takes longer, we need to make peace sustainable. And second, we need to keep the edge on confronting organized crime, whatever phase it presents.
Excellent, excellent. So we're going to take some questions from the audience. Raise your hand. The young ladies will bring you, clear in the back there, 2 hands up. Ladies will bring you microphones. Please introduce yourself, your affiliation, and ask a question.
Hi, good morning. Good afternoon, actually. Alejandro Sanchez from Gens Defense Weekly. My question is that on Saturday, President Santos went to Nariño, Antioquia, and he promised that in 4 years, the Army's demining brigade will have cleared 21 million square meters of Colombian territory from mines, explosive ammunition that hasn't exploded yet. My question is, what do you think about this statement, and what will be the role of international organizations, the United Nations, the United States, via Southcom, the Halo Trust, and finally, do you think these 21 million square meters will be found? Will it be in areas that where the FARC operates, like in Choco, in Antioquia, in Putumayo? What's the next step for this clearing, for the clearing process of these mines? Thank you.
Well, I start with the final part of your question. You have the question and you have good answers at the same time for the question. Yes, in those areas, I believe are the most important caches and areas that contain those kind of devices. As you might know, there is a very important effort that has been led by Secretary Kerry, actually, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Norway. That effort was launched formally enhanced into a ministerial meeting in the past UN General Assembly with the presence of President Santos. And there are different countries, something like 24 countries, presented commitments for more than $100 million to contribute precisely to those efforts on demining. Demining is an important issue. And I keep saying sometimes in Colombia it's not necessarily mines as we know them, but explosive devices, improvised IEDs actually is what we have there. And of course these require a lot of effort, a lot of commitment, and I think those more than $100 million will be very important for the purpose of that objective. That of course has humanitarian consequences and are a very good step for a country that is really seeking for a stable peace. Now, on the other hand, on the Peace Colombia efforts, part of the money, or most of the money that the US committed is included into the Peace Colombia package. So that's another important and concrete step. In addition to that, Colombian government has decided to enlarge first from a battalion to brigade level unit dedicated to demining. So in addition to the humanitarian demining done with international standards with UN, OAS, and these private sector NGOs that are working onto this, Colombia has decided that part of its capability that was used for, let's say, military operational demining is going to be transformed into capabilities for humanitarian demining, but using this expertise. So we move from a battalion level to a brigade level. And actually the estimate is to move from original 500 to 1,000 men to reach the level of up to 10,000 men dedicated to this purpose. So, of course, life is about setting goals. And President Santos is trying to set an ambitious goal for the country. He has this international support, international resources, and at the same time, a national will and a national capability being put all together towards that end. And we should try, and if we don't make it, we should keep trying until we make it for the importance of the issue, for the good of Colombian people, and especially in the rural areas of the country.
Great. There was a gentleman there, Mr. Alonso with the AP.
Hi, thank you.
You always have good questions. I'm worried now.
No, I'm Luis Alonso with the AP. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Ambassador, I would like to ask you, without addressing specifically the funds that Congress could be approving for Colombia, if you could share with us a comment on the US election. Do you foresee a major change in strategy or emphasis if either candidate wins, and what could be the impact for the relationship with Colombia, and specifically the impact on the implementation of this process that you see with the election? Thank you.
Well, you can imagine, we really do not intervene into a political debate, and especially right now, at the level of debate that is out there, I mean, we really will not have any opinion. It's up to the American people. Americans will make their choice and they will decide, and whatever they decide, we will work with, and do our effort. The relationship between Colombia and the United States has an interesting element, bipartisanship. It was President Clinton that started Plan Colombia with a Republican majority in Congress. That's why you were there, Roger. Later on, President Bush came, and at some point there was a major majority of the Democratic Party in Congress. And during the President Obama administration, there has been a good time as well of Republican majority. In all cases, we have been able to grant US support, and we have been able to work with the administrations and US Congress. And that's, I think, the way we should continue to plan. I think we have a very special relationship, and a strategic one, now really on facts and issues between Colombia and the United States, just to put it in terms of a political cycle.
Well, I would just say that certainly Secretary Clinton has a significant history and background and awareness of these issues. But Senator Sessions, who's a principal advisor to the Republican candidate, was one of the pillars of Plan Colombia is planning. And he even said at a hearing, I support President Uribe's vision, win the war. 3 words, win the war. Another question up front here.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your time and your great insight on the situation now. My question, well, first of all, my name is Manuel, and I'm with the AU School of International Service. Sorry about that. But my question is about the involvement of the UN and what does it look like moving forward. We know that the tripartite monitoring and verification mechanism will still be in place and that the UN has pledged that they will continue their activities on the ground. Would the Colombian government consider it wise to seek to expand their role and make sure that the presence does not waver, especially through these troubled times? Thank you.
Well, that's a very important question. Right now, there's a very high appreciation for UN role in Colombia, no doubt from President Santos himself and the Colombian government as a whole. But recently, we have heard different points of view in the country expressing the importance of having UN playing a role in the country. As you know, the original timeline for the ceasefire was October 31st. During the weekend or last week, President Santos opened that space up to December 31st. And not to forget that President Santos, as the President of Colombia, Commander-in-Chief of Colombian Armed Forces, has the authority to move that time or schedule as he considers, frankly speaking. Second, I think that the UN mandate in Colombia already is formal. It's not anymore under analysis process, but it's already formal. There is a UN Security Council mandate in which the monitoring and verification was stated and the way this process should happen. So that is on right now in Colombia. And of course, part of the debate is that how much can it extend, relating to the current political process in Colombia. But I guess we have seen so much commitment from world leaders and from UN itself that we should, without adding expectations, have some comfort on the way this mandate can contribute to maintain the ceasefire and towards a future process of DDR.
Let's take one more question, the young lady up front here.
Ambassador, my name is Paola Rengifo. I'm with the Department of State. And you mentioned that the peace in Colombia needs to be sustainable. And sustainability includes social inclusion. I've seen that the opposition is feeding off some concerns about gay rights. And I would like to know how you think the government and the opposition and the most conservative sectors of Colombian society can reconciliate to find joint agreement on these issues.
Well, I think social inclusion and minorities inclusion in Colombia is very well developed in our constitution. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, certainly I'm not even a lawyer, but I can tell you that from different rulings from our constitutional court, those are issues that are, frankly speaking, beyond the reach of the executive or even the political discussion. Those are rights in Colombia that in different levels and at different situations have to be implemented and follow and consider. So I think on that regard, Colombia is somehow very well advanced in its constitutional development towards rights, especially for different minorities in the country.
So let me ask one last question, and it's not really an easy one, but I wanted to bring it up because it's important. A lot of people who voted no are deeply skeptical about the FARC's intentions to honor the agreement, and for that matter, even use the agreement to advance its continued insurrection. And that's the word they use in their private conversations with their supporters. and use the electoral process, gaining a foothold, and the substantial resources that they've accrued from involvement in drug trafficking. How much do you think they've got squirreled away in their rainy day fund from this cocaine trafficking and other criminality? And how do we go about sort of ruining their plans by getting that money, freezing that money and putting it at the disposal of the Colombian state?
No, your question is very good. You know that, and we can bring the intelligence analysts and they will give you their insights and their perspective. But I think in such a delicate issue, we have to be careful and not to speculate, on the issue. There's no doubt that the Colombian government will and has all this time not only announced but effectively fight the drug trade. And as I said, for the year 2015 was record year in cocaine seizure. The year 16 is even looking better. And I can assure you that cocaine is not being selected who do you get from or who you don't. That cocaine is coming out of the production system, and every time we seize that cocaine, certainly we're harming criminal finances. So I think, out of this increase, probably there were some expectations, calculations coming out of the criminal organizations, including the purposes of the FARC in that regard. But at the same time, is Colombian government will and decision to continue to go after. And I will also underline the importance of public statements coming out of the Attorney General office, saying that his will, his determination, and his obligation is to go after any kind of funds obtained through illegal or criminal activities. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an all-important signal of the way Colombia will continue to perceive and approach this effort beyond our commitment and our national will to peace that we expect really to materialize in the sooner the better.
Good question, good answer. Thank you very much. And let me just say in closing that I a few months ago saw a video of a father who was saying, the FARC killed my son. And he said, but I'm going to support this agreement because I have two other sons that are still alive. And he doesn't just want an accord. He doesn't want just politicians to work sort of, split the difference or whatever. He wants peace, a definitive peace, and a lasting and permanent one. And that's something I think that should be the interest of the American people too. Because of the drugs, yes, but because I think you're right that as Colombia is able to end this 52-year-old armed uprising by these folks and demobilize them as it has tens of thousands of others in its history, it'll prove a lot. And I think Colombia remains a very key partner for us, and to the extent we can make it more stable, more prosperous, more unified, more democratic, I think it serves all of our interests. And I, with that secular prayer, I will thank everyone for coming, and thank you, Ambassador. Please join me for the recognizing this contribution. Very well done. Thank you. All right, we ended up in time.